Sonic, the heart of your system.
Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are back with another RX 5700 XT review. Today we are looking at ASRock's Taichi X OC Plus. So this is a big and bold graphics card. It's got a very unique design aesthetic which I think is definitely going to polarize opinion, and of all the factory overclock cards we have seen so far, this actually has the highest out of the box rated clock speed with a game clock of 1935 MHz. Most interesting though is definitely the pricing, as this is also the most expensive 5700 XT we have reviewed so far, as this is priced at £470 here in the UK. The question we're going to be asking today is whether or not a 5700 XT can justify that sort of price. If we kick off this review with a look at the design of the card, like I said, this is definitely going to split opinion. So it is a mostly silver plastic shroud, but there are also some black sections as well. But you can see it's got this really kind of aggressive angular design, and there's also bits of the plastic which are raised up and kind of run over the fans themselves, which gives the shroud this 3D look. So it's definitely not a very flat or just plain looking graphics card. The card's three fans also contribute to this kind of edgy aesthetic. We've got these two fans on the outside which measure 90mm, and these have dark translucent fan blades, but the fan in the middle has clear fan blades, and this one is also slightly smaller, measuring 80mm. That central fan though does actually sit within an LED ring, so when the system is powered on, this obviously lights up and it uses the clear fan blades to kind of act as a diffuser. This, along with another RGB zone on the front side of the card, means you do get a really good light show from the Taichi X, so if RGB is your thing, then this may well appeal to you. It's definitely a pretty unique design overall for a 5700 XT, and it's definitely, I think, the most out there of the cards we have reviewed so far. The one thing I would say though, personally it's not for me, but obviously that is a highly subjective area. But even if it's not really your kind of thing, I wouldn't really rule it out just yet, because you have to kind of remember, unless you're installing this card vertically in your case, you're not really going to be looking at the underside of the shroud and those fans. You're more going to be looking at the backplate, which we'll get onto in a little bit. So like I said, even if it's not really your cup of tea, I don't think this aggressive design is the end of the world for the Taichi X. One thing that could stop you buying this card though is the sheer size, as this is by far the biggest custom 5700 XT card we have reviewed so far. So the official dimensions come in at 324 by 35mm by 145.39mm by 53.18mm. So it's over 30 centimeters long. It's also quite tall as well for a graphics card, and the thickness makes it a 2.5 slot design. So as I always say, and particularly is the case for the Taichi X, definitely make sure that this card can actually fit in your case. If we move over to the front side of the shroud now, here there are three things worth mentioning. The first thing is the dual BIOS switch. So by default the card ships using the OC BIOS, but you can of course flick this over to the silent BIOS if you wish, and we do test both of these later on. Secondly, in the middle of the card, like we already showed, is that Taichi logo with kind of more of that cog and gear styling, and that is another of the RGB zones. And then thirdly, there is actually a second switch just on the edge of the PCB, which is a master LED control. So simply flick the LED on or off. If you don't want to faff around with any software, you know you don't want the lighting, you can just flick it off before you even install the card, and that way you don't have to deal with any of the RGB. Flipping the card over, we can also get a look at the Taichi's backplate, and I have to say I do really like this design. So it's a full-length metal backplate, but it's kind of got this two-tone look. So I'd say about 2/3 of it is just brushed black metal, but then there's also this grey section with some more of those cogs and gear styling, which is a signature of ASRock's Taichi line. And I have to say, personally, I do really like this aesthetic. So remember, like we said, if you're installing this card horizontally, you're really only going to be looking onto the backplate. And for me personally, this is a big plus for the Taichi. Moving on now to our display outputs. This is actually quite an interesting area for the Taichi, which isn't something we say about every graphics card. So what ASRock has done, they've actually fitted a total of 6 display outputs to the Taichi. So we get 4 display ports and then 2 HDMI. So that's an extra 2 video outputs compared to most standard 5700 XT. So if you do have some kind of crazy multi-monitor setup and you want to connect, 6 monitors to 1 graphics card, you can do that with the Taichi. Just before moving on as well, it's also worth pointing out that power requirements are pretty much what we've come to expect now from a flagship 5700 XT, as you need 2 8-pin PCI power connectors to run this card. Now we come to disassembly and looking at the PCB. So the first thing to note is once the cooler is actually removed from the PCB, we can see there is another black metal frame which actually sits on top of the PCB itself. So this basically acts as a heatsink. It uses thermal pads to draw heat away from those memory modules. That is screwed in with a few more screws, so once that is removed we can finally get a look at the bare PCB itself. And there we can see that ASRock has gone with a 10+1 VRM for the GPU, while it's also a 2-phase VRM for the memory. Those memory modules as well do come from Micron. It's 8GB of 14 gigabit per second GDDR6 memory. And then we can also get a look at that Navi 10 GPU sitting in the middle of the PCB. As for the heatsink itself, which we already removed, we can see that this is comprised of 2 separate aluminium fin stacks, and these are connected by 5 6mm nickel plated heat pipes. The GPU itself contacts with a copper cold plate, while there is also a separate plate and thermal pads for the VRM, and remember that the memory is cooled by that metal plate which we removed earlier. So that is it for our look at the card and the cooler itself, but now we need to see just how well this cooler actually performs. To do that, as this is a dual BIOS card, we did test both the OC and the silent BIOS, so you will see 2 entries for all of these upcoming charts, one for OC and one for the silent BIOS. If we start with our kind of overview look at GPU edge temperature, here the Taichi does well enough. Using the OC BIOS, we saw a peak GPU edge temperature of 70 degrees, but actually even more impressive is the peak temperature of 64 degrees, which was achieved when using the silent BIOS. If it sounds a bit counterintuitive that the silent BIOS is actually running cooler than the OC BIOS, as we will see in just a little bit, the silent BIOS does run the core significantly slower, so that explains the lower GPU temperature. As for the AMD specific junction and memory temperature results now, again we see decent results. Particularly impressive for me was the peak junction temperature of just 76 degrees when using the silent BIOS, with the OC BIOS running about 10 degrees hotter in terms of junction temp. Memory temperatures though we can also see slightly higher with the OC BIOS, where we saw a peak memory temperature of 78 degrees, and that is 4 degrees hotter than both the Power Color Red Devil as well as the Sapphire Nitro Plus, but that is still well within spec. It's when we move on to noise levels that we can see potentially one of the biggest drawbacks for using the OC BIOS, with noise levels coming in around 46 decibels. This is definitely getting on to be a little bit loud. I wouldn't say it's raucous, it's definitely not as loud as something like the Radeon 7 or Vega 64, but it is definitely audible and is louder than the other custom 5700 XTs we have seen so far. Thankfully, the silent BIOS does improve things with noise levels much lower, about 40-41 decibels, and that was because the fans simply spin slower when using the silent BIOS, where we saw fan speeds hover around the 1700 RPM range, and when using the OC BIOS this is more like 20-30 RPM, so a fairly significant reduction in fan speed when moving from the OC BIOS to the silent BIOS. As for power draw now, here we can really see the negative consequence for going for a heavy factory overclock for a 5700 XT, as the Taichi was actually drawing equivalent amounts of power as an RTX 2080 Ti. So we have seen this a bit before when manually overclocking, but the higher you push the core frequencies on a 5700 XT, efficiency basically just goes out the window. Thankfully, again, silent BIOS does come to the rescue, as we see power draw for that BIOS actually being only slightly higher than the reference 5700 XT. If we move on now to look at the Taichi's performance when it comes to games, we'll start by assessing its average clock speed under load. So across our 30-minute Firestrike Ultra stress test, we saw the Taichi averaging 1964 MHz under load when using the OC BIOS, and that is actually the fastest we've seen from any 5700 XT so far. Interestingly, the silent BIOS does reduce clock speed significantly, with that card averaging 1840 MHz under load, so that is about 120 MHz less than the OC BIOS. As for our actual game benchmarks now, here we are just showing results from using the OC BIOS purely due to time constraints, but we do know by now that pretty much all our 5700 XTs perform within a pretty close margin of each other, and that is definitely the same thing here for the Taichi. That said though, its extra frequency does give it a slight lead over the Power Color Red Devil and also the Sapphire Nitro Plus, as we saw it averaging 2% higher frame rates across the board than those cards. In the real world though, this is really only going to be about 1 or 2 frames per second at 1440p, so it's not a huge difference, but it is worth noting that this is technically the fastest 5700 XT we have reviewed so far. The extra frequency does as well help close the gap on our RTX 2070 Super, as the Taichi proved just 3% slower on average across all of our games. That also means the Taichi is actually 18% faster than the RTX 2060 Super, but up against the more expensive 2080 Super, that card is actually 16% faster than this Taichi, though we were never really expecting a 5700 XT to come close to the 2080 Super. By now though, I think if you know how fast one 5700 XT runs, you pretty much know how fast they all run, as, like I said, they do all perform within a very small margin of each other. It does just happen that the Taichi is the fastest 5700 XT we have reviewed so far, due to its higher factory overclock. To see if we could squeeze any more frequency from this card, we of course tried our hand at manually overclocking, and here we were able to effectively max out the frequency slider while also maxing out the power limit for this card, and we were also able to achieve a maximum overclock of 950 MHz for the GDDR6 memory. This overclock saw our average clock speed under load rise to 2080 MHz, which works out as a 6% frequency increase over stock behaviour. As expected, this didn't result in massive gains for the Taichi. We actually saw performance increase between 4 and 6% in our 3D Mark benchmarks, and then we also retested a few of our games at 1440p. By now we know that Navi doesn't manually overclock that well. We never really see more than about 5 or 6% from a manual overclock. So the Taichi is able to achieve that, so it's definitely not terrible, but then same goes for all Navi cards, it's not really a great manual overclock either. The clear downside to this overclock though is definitely power draw, which went absolutely bananas. In fact, we saw total system power draw exceed 420 watts under load. So that actually works out as a 19% power increase for just 4 to 6% performance gain. So in my book, that is definitely not worth it. So then we can really wrap up this review now, and I have to say overall I do think the Taichi is a decent card. I'm definitely not that impressed with the OC BIOS, as for me it runs too loud and it's also far too power hungry, but thankfully there is that silent BIOS which gives a much better all-round balance of power, noise and also performance. With that in mind, coupled with the unique design aesthetic, which I'm sure is going to definitely appeal to some gamers out there, I would say the Taichi is worth buying. That is, as long as the pricing was reasonable, and unfortunately, at the time of filming this video, I think the Taichi is just too expensive. That's because it's currently priced at £470 for us here in the UK, and to me this is just too expensive for any 5700 XT. I don't think it really matters just how good the card is. For me, it's just too close to 2070 Super territory. In fact, at the time of filming this video, I can actually see a dual fan custom card from KFA, which was actually selling for just £475, so just £5 more than this Taichi. If the Taichi itself was £50 cheaper, then yeah, I do think it would be worth buying. It's not the absolute best 5700 XT we've reviewed, and I do think it does need to be cheaper than both the Power Color Red Devil and also the Sapphire Nitro Plus. But say it was around 410, 420, then I think yeah, it would be worth buying. But currently it really is just the price, it's just too high for a custom 5700 XT. Hopefully ASRock will get the message and we will see pricing come down in the future. But right now, if you do have about £470 to spend on a graphics card, you could either save a little bit of cash and go for a slightly cheaper 5700 XT, but really that price is right around the 2070 Super territory. And bearing in mind that card is actually faster and also has the benefit of ray tracing, if it were me, that is probably the direction I would go. Anyway guys, that is going to do it for this video. If you liked it, you can give us a thumbs up. Also leave me a comment, let me know what you think down below. Would you spend this much money on a 5700 XT? I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. We'd also love to chat with you guys on Discord, so you can find our invitation link in the description below. If you like this t-shirt I've been wearing, you can also find our merch store, which is also linked down below. And lastly, if you'd like to get some of our content early and also get access to exclusive giveaways, you can consider backing us on Patreon. Until then though guys, I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.